Let me take you inside one of the most explosive geopolitical standoffs unfolding right now. What I am about to share with you could fundamentally reshape the balance of power across the Middle East for generations to come. So settle in, because the story we are examining today involves a confrontation that could spiral into open conflict at any moment. We are talking about Iran and the United States, two giants that have been locked in hostility for over 4 decades, now standing at the edge of the abyss. Before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video. It helps the algorithm show it to a wider audience. And please leave a comment with your thoughts. Let's discuss. Let me start with the raw facts, the ones that have sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles worldwide in recent days. Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, delivered a statement that landed like a diplomatic bombshell. His exact words: "Iran will never abandon uranium enrichment, even if war is imposed upon us." You heard that correctly. Even in the face of war. This sentence, my friends, is not empty rhetoric. This is a red line drawn in the sands of the Persian Gulf with potentially catastrophic consequences. Araghchi went further, insisting that uranium enrichment represents a sovereign right of Iran, and that the Islamic Republic's nuclear program serves exclusively peaceful purposes. Peaceful. That is the word he chose. But let us face reality. When a nation enriches uranium to 60% purity, we are far, far removed from the requirements of a civilian energy program. To power nuclear reactors, do you know what you need? 3 to 5% enrichment. 60% places you squarely in dangerous territory, the zone that brings you inexorably closer to weapons-grade material. To produce usable bomb material, you typically need to reach 90%. And technically speaking, jumping from 60 to 90% happens far more quickly than climbing from 0 to 60. Now, let me explain why this should concern all of us, whether you are in Paris, Berlin, Washington, or Riyadh. Iran has crossed both a psychological and technical threshold. Tehran is essentially telling us, we are just weeks, perhaps months, away from possessing the bomb if we choose to go that route. This is what geopolitical analysts call nuclear threshold capability. Iran may not yet possess the weapon itself, but it has all the ingredients sitting in its pantry, ready to be assembled at the opportune moment. But hold on, because the story gets even more intriguing. Mohammad Eslami, the Iranian vice president overseeing the Atomic Energy Organization, threw what appears to be a lifeline into the middle of this diplomatic storm. He announced that Iran would be willing to reduce the enrichment level of its currently stockpiled 60% uranium, but only under one absolute condition: that Washington lifts all, and I mean all, economic sanctions imposed on Tehran. Let us think through this proposition together. On one hand, Iran declares, "We will never surrender our enrichment rights." On the other hand, it says, "But we can negotiate about enrichment levels." This represents classic negotiating posture, establishing an unbreakable red line on principle while leaving maneuvering room on practical implementation. This is Iranian-style negotiation, subtle and layered, where every word carries weight, and seemingly contradictory positions coexist in a carefully orchestrated dialectic. But here is where the picture turns truly ominous, my friends. While these negotiations unfold in the plush rooms of diplomacy, the military reality on the ground tells an entirely different story. And this story is playing out in the waters of the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. Right at this very moment, as I speak to you, an American carrier strike group sits deployed in the region. We are talking about an aircraft carrier, likely accompanied by missile cruisers, destroyers equipped with the Aegis system, attack submarines, and all the logistics that allow this armada to project absolutely devastating firepower. This presence is anything but trivial. It is not symbolic. This is a demonstration of force, a silent yet deafening message dispatched to Tehran. We have our finger on the trigger, and we will not hesitate if necessary. Picture the scene. Tens of thousands of tons of American steel floating just a few hundred kilometers from Iranian shores. Fighter jets ready to launch at any moment. Tomahawk cruise missiles programmed and targeted. Anti-missile defense systems scanning the skies 24 hours a day. This is constant military pressure, a sword of Damocles suspended above the Islamic Republic. And let me tell you something that mainstream media does not always explain clearly. When the United States deploys a carrier strike group, it is never just for show. Every movement of these vessels is calculated, planned, integrated into a comprehensive strategy. These groups can transition from mere presence to offensive action within hours. Targets are already identified, attack plans already drafted. Everything is ready. So why this military escalation while negotiations are ongoing? This is the full complexity of American foreign policy, and this is what makes the situation so dangerous. Washington is applying what we might call 21st century gunboat diplomacy. Yes, we negotiate, but with an aircraft carrier in our back pocket. The idea is straightforward. Show your adversary that if talks fail, the military option is not just on the table. It is already deployed and operational. Now, let us put ourselves in the shoes of Iranian leadership for a moment. Imagine you are in Tehran, in the halls of power. You look out the window and you know that just a few hundred kilometers off your coast, there exists enough firepower to obliterate your nuclear infrastructure in a single night. Your enrichment sites, your research facilities, your storage centers, everything could be wiped off the map within hours. How would you react? Two options present themselves. First option, you fold, you accept American conditions, you dismantle your nuclear program, and you hope the sanctions will be lifted. But in doing so, you lose your primary negotiating leverage, your national pride, and most critically, you render yourself vulnerable to the whims of Washington, which could reimpose sanctions overnight, just as we witnessed when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the 2015 accord. Second option, you hold firm. You continue enriching, you maintain your position of principle, and you gamble that the Americans will not dare cross the Rubicon of military intervention, because the consequences would be absolutely catastrophic for the entire region. And this second option is clearly what Tehran has chosen, as evidenced by Araghchi's explosive declaration. But here, my dear viewers, we touch the heart of the problem. We find ourselves in a geopolitical prisoner's dilemma. Both parties have an interest in cooperation, but they fear being duped by the other even more. The United States cannot trust the Iranians to honor an agreement, because Tehran has already violated certain provisions of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. For their part, the Iranians cannot trust the Americans, because Washington withdrew from that same agreement, even as all international agencies confirmed Iran was complying with it. Do you see where I am going with this? We are trapped in a mutual trust deadlock. And when you add massive American military presence in the region to this equation, you get an explosive cocktail where the slightest spark could ignite a regional conflagration. Let us now discuss what an armed conflict between the United States and Iran would actually mean. Because this is not some Hollywood movie scenario. It would be a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. First, Iran has developed formidable asymmetric warfare capabilities over decades. Tehran cannot confront the United States in conventional warfare. That much is obvious. The American military would crush Iranian forces within days in a direct confrontation. But Iran would not play that game. No, Tehran would immediately activate all its proxies, all its regional allies. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, groups in Syria. The entire region would instantly erupt in flames. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz. Understand the strategic importance of this maritime passage. 20% of the world's oil, 30% of seaborne oil, transits through this choke point that measures only 34 kilometers at its narrowest point. Iran possesses the means to close this strait, at least temporarily. Naval mines, anti-ship missiles, fast attack craft armed with torpedoes. If tomorrow morning Iran decides to blockade Hormuz, oil prices would skyrocket, the global economy would slide into recession, and millions of people would suffer the economic consequences. This is why this crisis is not just a regional problem. It is a global threat. Every European motorist filling their tank, every business dependent on maritime transport, every energy importing nation would be directly affected by a conflict in the Persian Gulf. But let us return to the negotiations, because despite all this tension, discussions continue. And this is where we see the full sophistication of Iranian diplomacy. Tehran is playing on multiple boards simultaneously. On one side, the hard line, embodied by Araghchi and his categorical refusal to abandon enrichment. On the other, the extended hand, represented by Eslami, and his compromise proposal on enrichment levels. This dual-track strategy allows Iran to maintain its position of principle while keeping the door open to an agreement. It is brilliant from a tactical standpoint. You demonstrate that you cannot be intimidated, that even military threats will not make you bend on your fundamental rights, but you simultaneously offer the Americans an honorable exit from the crisis. Now, let us look at things from Washington's perspective. The American administration faces a Cornelian choice. If it agrees to lift all sanctions in exchange for a simple reduction in enrichment level, without dismantling the program, it will appear to have capitulated to Iranian demands. Its regional allies, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia, will scream betrayal. They will say that Washington has allowed Iran to remain a threshold nuclear state, capable of manufacturing a bomb within months if the situation demands it. On the other hand, if the United States refuses all negotiation and opts for the military solution, it will find itself engaged in a conflict with unpredictable ramifications, with astronomical human, financial, and political costs, and with no guarantee that airstrikes, however massive, will definitively destroy the Iranian nuclear program. The facilities are dispersed. Some are buried deep underground, protected by meters of concrete and rock. It would likely require an air campaign lasting several weeks, possibly followed by a ground intervention, to be certain of destroying everything. And there, we are talking about a military commitment of an entirely different magnitude. So, what is going to happen? Honestly, my friends, if I could predict the future with certainty, I would probably be advising governments rather than speaking to you here. But what I can do is analyze the different possible scenarios. Scenario number 1, the compromise agreement. Washington and Tehran find common ground. The United States agrees to progressively lift sanctions in exchange for reducing enrichment to, say, 20%, with reinforced inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This would satisfy no one completely, but it would be acceptable to everyone. This is what diplomacy calls a viable compromise, even if imperfect. Scenario number 2, prolonged status quo. Negotiations stall, neither party yields, but neither triggers the final escalation either. Iran continues enriching. Sanctions remain in place. American military pressure persists, and we live in this permanent tension that could explode at any moment. This is the most likely scenario in the short term, unfortunately. Scenario number 3, controlled military escalation. Imagine Iran crosses a red line, for example, by beginning to enrich to 80%, or by expelling international inspectors. The United States could then launch limited surgical strikes against a few key installations. Not total war, but enough to send a message. Iran would likely retaliate against American or allied targets in the region, but without going all the way to generalized war. Both sides would be careful not to cross the point of no return. Scenario number 4, the darkest, regional war. Uncontrolled escalation leads to open conflict. The United States launches a massive air campaign. Iran activates all its proxies, closes the Strait of Hormuz, perhaps attacks Israel or Saudi Arabia. Israel intervenes directly. The region goes up in flames. This scenario remains unlikely because no one has a real interest in going that far. But it is possible, and that is what makes the current situation so dangerous. What strikes me about this crisis is how perfectly it illustrates the limits of military power in the contemporary world. The United States possesses the most powerful military in human history. It can project unimaginable destructive force anywhere on the planet. And yet, it finds itself at an impasse against a country whose military budget represents a tiny fraction of its own. Why? Because military power no longer automatically translates into political influence. Because in an interconnected world, the consequences of conflict extend far beyond the battlefield. Because Iran has understood how to operate in gray zones, how to employ asymmetric warfare, how to transform its conventional weakness into strategic strength. Iran knows it cannot win a war against the United States, but it also knows it can make the cost of such a war so prohibitively high that Washington will hesitate to trigger it. This is deterrence through potential chaos. And so far, it is working. Now let us address the broader regional context, because this crisis does not unfold in a vacuum. The Middle East is already a powder keg. You have the war in Syria that is still not truly finished. You have the Yemen conflict that has dragged on for years. You have the permanent tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. You have the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia that structures all regional geopolitics. And now you add a nuclear crisis with the threat of American military intervention. Every regional actor is calculating how this crisis might affect its own interests. Saudi Arabia watches closely, perhaps hoping the United States will do the dirty work of neutralizing the Iranian threat, but also dreading the retaliation that Tehran might direct at the kingdom. Israel is probably pushing Washington to be firmer, while preparing its own action plans just in case. Turkey, Russia, China all have interests in this part of the world, and all will be affected by the outcome of this crisis. And then there is Europe, often forgotten in these analyses, but which also has a role to play. The Europeans attempted to maintain the 2015 nuclear accord even after American withdrawal. They created mechanisms to circumvent American sanctions and allow trade with Iran. But the reality is that without the United States, these efforts have been largely ineffective. European companies are too afraid of American secondary sanctions to risk doing business with Tehran. This brings us to a fundamental question. Who really dictates the rules of the international game? Theoretically, we live in a multipolar world. But when you look at this crisis, you see that the United States, through its economic and military power, can impose its will even on its allies. Europe would prefer a different approach, but it lacks the means to implement it independently of Washington. Let us return now to this Iranian proposal to reduce enrichment in exchange for lifting sanctions. To understand whether this is a serious offer or simply a delaying tactic, we must examine what Iran truly has to gain and lose. American economic sanctions have devastated the Iranian economy. Inflation has exploded, the currency has collapsed, unemployment has skyrocketed. The Iranian people suffer daily from the consequences of these sanctions. Medicine is scarce. Basic products are prohibitively expensive. Businesses are shutting down. The Iranian regime faces growing internal pressure. In this context, obtaining the lifting of sanctions would represent a major victory for Tehran. It would allow the economy to restart, improve the population's standard of living, and consolidate the regime's legitimacy. So, yes, Iran has a genuine interest in finding an agreement. But at the same time, the nuclear program has become a symbol of national pride, a demonstration that Iran will not allow the West to dictate its conduct. Completely abandoning this program would be perceived as humiliating capitulation. This is why Araghchi insists so strongly that enrichment will never stop, even in case of war. The question, therefore, is whether a reduction in enrichment level, say from 60 to 20%, would be sufficient to satisfy Washington while allowing Tehran to save face. Technically, 20% already exceeds what is necessary for a civilian program, but it falls far short of weapons-grade quality. It would be a compromise where each side could claim to have obtained something. But here, we need to be realistic. Trust between Washington and Tehran has reached absolute zero. How do you verify that Iran will honor its commitments? How do you ensure it is not secretly enriching elsewhere? How do you guarantee that the United States will not reimpose sanctions as soon as a new president arrives in the White House? These questions of verification and guarantees are absolutely crucial. The 2015 accord provided for a highly intrusive inspection regime, allowing international inspectors access to practically all Iranian facilities. But Iran has progressively reduced this cooperation after American withdrawal from the agreement. Re-establishing this level of transparency will be extremely difficult. And then there is the question of timing. Even if an agreement were reached tomorrow, how long would it take to implement? Months, probably. During that time, Iran would continue accumulating enriched uranium, drawing ever closer to the capability of manufacturing a bomb. Every day that passes without an agreement reduces the time the international community would have to react if Iran decided to take that final step. This is what we call breakout time. A few years ago, thanks to the 2015 agreement, this time was estimated at approximately 1 year. Today, with the stockpiles of enriched uranium Iran has accumulated, some experts estimate it could be reduced to just a few weeks or months. That is why the situation is so urgent. Now, I want to address an aspect that many commentators overlook: the domestic dimension of this crisis, both in the United States and in Iran. Because foreign policy is never disconnected from domestic politics. In the United States, any approach perceived as too conciliatory toward Iran would be immediately attacked as weakness. The political opposition would use this to criticize the administration in power. And with extremely influential pro-Israel and pro-Saudi lobbies in Washington, the room for maneuver for a compromise agreement is narrow. In Iran, it is even more complicated. Power is divided among different factions. You have the pragmatists, generally around the president and the foreign ministry, who would like an agreement to restart the economy. You have the hardliners, particularly within the Revolutionary Guards and religious institutions, who view any compromise with the United States as a betrayal of the principles of the Islamic Revolution. These different factions wage a constant struggle for influence, and each uses the nuclear dossier to advance its agenda. When Araghchi makes his uncompromising declaration, he is probably speaking as much to his domestic audience as to Washington. He is telling the hardliners in Iran, "Do not worry, we will not capitulate." And when Eslami mentions the possibility of a compromise, he sends a different message. We are reasonable. We can negotiate. This internal complexity makes negotiations extremely difficult, because even if negotiators find common ground, they must then sell it to their respective camps. And in the current political climate, both in Washington and Tehran, selling a compromise is a perilous exercise. Let us now talk about something that particularly concerns me: the risk of accidental escalation. With an American carrier strike group in the Gulf, with Iranian forces on high alert, with tensions at their peak, it would take just one incident, one misunderstanding, one miscalculation to trigger an uncontrollable spiral. Imagine a plausible scenario. An American reconnaissance aircraft flies near Iranian territorial waters. The Iranians, nervous, intercept it aggressively. The American pilots, feeling threatened, respond. An exchange of fire ensues. Perhaps an aircraft is shot down. Immediately, pressure mounts on both sides to respond. The United States cannot let an attack on their aircraft go unanswered. Iran must show it will not be intimidated. And just like that, within hours, you go from an isolated incident to a major crisis. This kind of scenario has happened before. In 1988, an American warship shot down an Iranian airliner, killing all passengers, because the crew had mistaken it for a military aircraft. It was a tragic error, but it illustrates how badly things can go wrong when tensions are high and armed forces are on edge. This is why American military presence in the region, though intended to deter Iran, paradoxically also increases the risk of accidental conflict. The more you concentrate armed forces in a restricted space, the higher the probability of incidents becomes. It is mathematical. So what should ideally happen? From the perspective of a rational observer, the solution is clear: a return to serious diplomacy with concessions from both sides. The United States should accept that Iran retains a limited and verified civilian enrichment program, in exchange for solid guarantees that this program will not drift toward military purposes. Iran should accept a level of transparency and inspection that reassures the international community, in exchange for progressive but substantial lifting of sanctions. But we do not live in an ideal world. We live in a world where mistrust, national pride, internal political calculations, and historical legacies complicate even the most obvious solutions. The reality, my friends, is that we are probably condemned to live with this crisis for a long time yet. Negotiations will continue, with advances and setbacks. Military pressure will remain present. Iran will probably continue enriching, cautiously, without crossing the threshold that would automatically trigger intervention. The United States will maintain sanctions, perhaps with some minor adjustments, and all of us will hold our breath, hoping that no spark ignites the powder keg. What fascinates me from an analytical perspective is how this crisis reveals the profound mutations of the international order. We are far from the Cold War era, when two superpowers divided the world. Today, we have mid-level regional actors like Iran, who can challenge the greatest world power and get away with it, at least temporarily. Iran has understood that in the 21st century world, you do not need to be the strongest militarily to wield influence. You need to be strategic, to be patient, to exploit your adversary's weaknesses, to play on divisions within the international community, to use geography to your advantage, to develop asymmetric capabilities that make the cost of intervention prohibitive. This is a lesson that other countries are watching closely. If Iran succeeds in maintaining its nuclear program despite American pressure, it will send a message to all countries that might want to challenge Washington. It is possible, if you are willing to pay the price, and if you play smart. In conclusion, my dear viewers, we stand at a pivotal moment. The coming weeks, the coming months, will determine whether this crisis resolves through diplomacy or tips toward conflict. The declarations by Araghchi and Eslami show that Iran is playing a tight game, refusing to yield on principles, but opening the door to practical compromises. American military presence in the Gulf shows that Washington is not bluffing and is prepared to use force if necessary. Between these two positions, there may perhaps be space for an agreement. But that space is narrow, and the path to reach it is fraught with obstacles. Every day without diplomatic progress brings us closer to the point where one of the two parties might decide the status quo is no longer sustainable and action must be taken. This is why I will continue following this story very closely and talking to you about it regularly. Because what is unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now is not just another regional crisis. It is a test of the international order, a confrontation between two worldviews, a trial of strength between established power and a determined challenger.